So I'm gonna share with you the history of startups in Puerto Rico, which is the requested, and I'll be happy to then go as deep into the question as you want. And I'm actually going to go back to 1996 in order to share with you a little bit of what's happened in the past. In 1996, and I don't know how familiar, I'm going to assume that people are not really familiar with Puerto Rico and the institutions, et cetera, and how the place operates. Nobody understands how it operates. But the Government Development Bank is the bond issuer. So when we go to here to Wall Street to raise funding for the public sector, that's done by something called the GDB, the Government Development Bank. So the Government Development Bank in '96 saw that there was no infrastructure or basis for venture capital in Puerto Rico, et cetera, and they created something called Guayacan. Guayacan is a nonprofit. It's literally a nonprofit fund of funds. What's a fund of funds? A fund of funds is a fund that invests in venture capital funds. So the concept was, and continues to be, let's start getting the capital people used to the concept of risk, not just investing in bonds and stuff that's safe, by creating a fund of funds and start investing in US-based venture capital funds. And that's actually what Guayacan, the main business of Guayacan. Whenever you hear Guayacan, that's actually what they do. It's a fund of funds invested in US venture capital firms. In 1999, they decide we really need to do a little bit more of community building. They start something called the Puerto Rico Venture Forum, which is basically the annual summit of venture capital entrepreneurship in Puerto Rico. And then around the year 2004, I was actually asking, they start the Enterprise. Enterprise was the first business plan competition back when business plan competitions mattered, which they don't. And so, but that was the beginning of hey, how can we do an outreach program, a continuous outreach program, to draw ideas from the community, get them into a structured process and push them out. At the same time, the government was, besides the Guayacan path, back in the 90s when the internet bubble was, in all its glory, and actually I was in the valley in the middle of that glory before the glorious destruction of my company. There was a push towards venture capital. There is a company called Advent Mora, which is a venture capital, or at least was a venture capital firm at the time, and they made a number of investments in some companies, and the government also put money into a number of companies. Incredibly unprofitable for the government. The government probably deployed about $200 million of capital to push innovation, R&D, et cetera, which if anybody who runs a venture or knows about venture capital knows that that's an enormous amount of money. But the government really didn't know how to do that, so it lost the vast majority of it. But there are some companies that came out of that generation. Outsourcing Solutions makes alchavo.com, which is a kind of like a web-based accounting service. Altamente came out of that generation. Vernet, which Altamente is a open source hardware company. Out of that generation came Vernet, which is an educational software company. So there were a number of firms that were built back then that are still around. From this very first generation of the building of internet companies or startups or entire idea. But there was no ecosystem, there was no community, there was no nothing. I mean, it was just one-offs in reality. And there was after that big burst, because everybody was interested because it was the bubble, there was literally a 10-year time frame where basically nothing happened. I got there in 2001, and I was looking for a technology community because I had spent the earlier 13 years in Silicon Valley. So when I got to Puerto Rico, I assumed that there was a technology community because there's a technology community, except there wasn't. the people that I ran into were actually the government people that were trying to push some government thing. And that's actually how I started at Pritco, which is the industrial development company, which is the public corporation that is in charge of attracting foreign capital to Puerto Rico. And they knew that they didn't have the practices or the knowledge, or they're the guys that put $200 million and lost $200 million trying to do this. And they knew that they didn't know what they were doing. And at the time, in 2004, they set up something called the Puerto Rico Science, Technology, and Research Trust, which is a kind of a private nonprofit with a government charter. It should remind you, unfortunately, of Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac, and that these are things that are private but government chartered in some way. You know, so there's a funny relationship. And I'm going to pause your mind on that, bookmark that idea that this entity exists and was created in 2004. So basically nothing's happening in this time. Nothing in Puerto Rico is happening at all in terms of startups from a systematic perspective. And in 2010 is when the first stirrings of startup occurred from a community perspective, which is like the beginning of Startups of Puerto Rico. That logo was in 2010. And what happened was that during my years of government service, I ran into Ramfi Castro. I know that you had a conversation with him. So Ramfis is an entrepreneur. He worked at Microsoft in Redmond in the past, and he had done a startup in Puerto Rico, et cetera. So he went to the School of Hard Knocks and all that. and I literally, I was like, when I came back to Puerto Rico from having started my company in the Valley in '95, I was like I was broke. I was like incredibly tired. I mean, from working for years. I mean, just on a 24. And I couldn't even work. I mean, I couldn't work because I didn't have the capacity to work. And I was just like, that hurt. That was tough. That was really tough. Oh, School of Hard Knocks. This is what it feels like. It's a real thing, So in 2010, what happened is that Ramfis and I decided that that it wasn't real, that what was happening in Puerto Rico wasn't real. It was still, because it was still very much top down. So what happens is that Puerto Rico is a very traditional society. It's really a Latin American society. So the default behaviors of people is hierarchical, programmatic. Oh, I'll create a program, and then XYZ things will happen. That's not how the Valley got started, and that's not how the Valley operates, and that's not how entrepreneurship operates. Entrepreneurship in general is a visionary manifestation of a manifestation of the vision of entrepreneurs, and it's very network oriented in how it operates. I mean, you can there are many mechanisms that are. I mean, from having spent 13 years in the Valley, which I did, you really observe how the yeast is made. It's very much of a yeast. And that's why it'll take a long time for New York to catch up, because the Valley has been working on that yeast since the 40s, at least since the 40s. And so it's a lot deeper. And by the way, that's the only thing that people do there. Whereas New York, there is fashion, there's Wall Street, there's marketing, there's many other things that are important. There's only one thing, and it's startups. So so New York will have its growing pains, because there's a whole cycle, a multi-decade cycle in terms of how you build these ecosystems. Anyway, 2010, Ramfis and I decide this is not happening. The best information is not getting to the entrepreneurs, because we're on Twitter, we're on Facebook, where we can see what's happening in the Valley. And okay, great, we're going to do our first event. We're going to do a simulcast, or basically a webcast, of the Startup Lessons Learned Conference. That was April 23, 2010. And the Startup Lessons Learned Conference, you heard about the Lean Startup, Eric Ries, etc. That was the first event that he did, And so we said, great, we're gonna put out this video. We think that this is important. As a matter of fact, I had actually, in January, I had started publishing the podcast for Steve Blank. Steve Blank is the Stanford professor who has reconstructed entrepreneurship. He single-handedly just rebuilt the global notion of what entrepreneurship is. And so I had started doing that, but that was almost like a little private thing. It wasn't a community thing. I was just doing it for him. In that event, April 23, we do that event. And it was literally just the people who cared about startups got together to watch this video online. That's all we did. But that was really the first thing. And then the second thing we did was, have you guys heard about This Week in Startups? There's a New York, Jason Calacanis. Jason Calacanis is, Engadget. So he founded Weblogs, which is a company that published Engadget, and sold it to AOL. And that's how he made his money. He's actually a New York guy. And he now lives in Santa Monica, and he has a show called This Week in Startups. And it's basically, broadcast over YouTube or Ustream, whatever. And so we were like, God, people here don't know how to pitch companies. It's like, there's no reason to learn how to pitch if there's no one to pitch to. So people are not in the practice. So we were, okay, great. We need to intervene. We need to at least get people to know how to pitch. And so we decide, and it turns out that, this is getting really detailed, but This Week in Startups was going to have a global meetup in September 22nd or so, 2010. And they were basically going to go use Skype in order to go into different startup communities around the world. And we go, great, that's our opportunity. We're going to register for that. We're going to do that. But we're also I had gone to South by Southwest in 2010, so I called up Jason Cohen, who's a very successful entrepreneur in Austin, and called him up and said, or actually emailed him, can you do a little pitch workshop for startups in Puerto Rico? And he said yes, because it's a pay-forward culture. All startup people are very, all good startup people are very open. Obviously, they're going to say yes, and he said yes. And so literally, what we did that night is that we got people together in Colegio de Ingenieros, for the people who know, that building, and we gave them a little workshop on how to pitch their company, and just from our knowledge and background, and from Venture Hacks. There's a book called Pitching Hack, which is invaluable. And then we got Jason Cohen on Skype to give the entrepreneurs some feedback on their pitches. Now, here's the important part from that evening. It was the first time that people just literally freaked out in terms of, all right, pitch. And people were just like frozen because it was the first time. It was like, you're going to steal my idea? It's like, so there was no idea at the time that it is a paid-forward culture and that our intent is to help you. That didn't exist, because you could cut the air, with the tension from people that didn't know what was going to happen. But someone said, okay, great, I'll do it, and then someone pitched, and then we started giving them feedback. Oh, you didn't segment it correctly, or the product, you didn't mention this or that, or your business model is broken, or blah, blah, blah. And then that was really the beginning of, oh, wait a second, this is a community interaction aimed at helping each other. But people didn't know that walking into that room. And, but by the end of the evening, people were like, oh, well, I want to pitch, but it's like, oh, it's 11 o'clock, we gotta go home. And then we actually went on This Week in Startups. You can watch that. We can share the link later. You can watch when we got on This Week in Startups because it's recorded on YouTube, Jason Calacanis. So anyway, so we go, great, that was good. Then Ramphis gets Startup Weekend. So he says, in 2011, we're going to do Startup Weekend. And he convinces Startup Weekend, you're supposed to have a facilitator that's experienced in the way that Startup Weekends work. But Startup Weekend is basically a 54-hour event where you go on Friday with a bunch of people that you don't even know, and you come up with, 50 people came in to that event, and at the end there were 7 companies built in 54 hours over a weekend. So we did that in October 2011, and that was really the first time that we actually started flying people in that knew what they were doing, and building stuff together, and that worked out really great. And then in December of 2011, we did TEDx San Juan, which is basically perhaps you're familiar with TED conferences, and they have a format where you can run a local version of the TED conference. No one had ever done this. This is actually an off-the-shelf thing that anybody could have done. Just a startup weekend. Anybody could have done it. Nobody was doing it. So Ramphis, it was really Ramphis' leadership, and he said, "Great, we're gonna do this," and we did. And it was a great event. You can ask anybody. It was a really extraordinary event. Now, the TED is not exactly a startup event, but it was the beginning of us getting into, beyond our little cocoon of startups, getting out to the regular community and saying we're participants. We're doing stuff that matters, because that's when everybody wants to be a TED speaker, and then everybody was like, we started to see some incoming. And then in 2012, we said, we need to, at the time we thought, we need to get people into accelerators, in the States. We need to train them to get them into accelerators. And because we saw that, accelerators, by 2012, it was already clear that Y Combinator, Techstars, et cetera, that model was already quite clear. We said we just got to push people in because we need to build the networks. We can't think in a non-networked way about building a startup community. We need to ship people off. And so we discovered the Founder Institute. The Founder Institute is a pre-accelerator. It's a Silicon Valley-based organization. When you go to an accelerator, the assumption going into accelerator is that at the end of 3 months after their interventions, you will be able to raise capital from actual professional venture capitalist firms. So to get into an accelerator, you already have to have you have to be quite along. You have to already be full-time. You have to be basically fundable with some tweaks. Because in 3 months, that's all you can really do. But Founder Institute is really oriented towards enabling you to get to that point, enabling you to quit your job. And so we started working with that. And Founder Accelerator is an amazing organization. It was started in 2009 by Adeo Ressi, who happens to be Elon Musk's college roommate. And being networking, you got to know the people. It's already, that was in 2009, from scratch. It's already in 45 cities around the world, in 6 continents. We're in Africa, Europe, 6 continents. The only one that is missing is Antarctica. So we haven't, we'll able to get there. And so we were able to train 9 people last year, and we drew some sponsorships from visionaries at Ferraioli. Ferraioli is a law firm, and with a focus on intellectual property. And they always were looking for a way of getting into the startup thing, but they didn't know how to do it. And we said, look, we're going to bring a program, you're going to sponsor it. And they said yes, and they have. And then the other people were BDO. BDO is a global accounting firm, but the people who built the BDO branch in Puerto Rico are Sher and Fernandez. And these guys are entrepreneurs. And so when they saw what we were doing, they were like, we're going to back you because you're crazy. And they backed us. So we got the sponsorship, and that's when we started to be able to fly in real mentors to Puerto Rico for the first time. We had people like Luke Beatty. Luke Beatty founded Associated Content, sold it $400 million to Yahoo. He came. We had Siv Gillat, who, you guys ever heard of iFi? iFi is basically like an SD card for your phone that has a Wi-Fi hotspot in it. So you take a regular, you're used to take, when you're taking a photo with a regular camera, with an iPhone, for you to be able to share that. But you bring that experience to a regular, DSLR, through the chip that they make. That's a $300 million company, incredibly well known in the Valley, in the hardware business. He came. And we had a number of the people who founded, Daniel Hoffer, who founded Couchsurfing, he came. So we were beginning to get like real startup people and really training founders. And some of those founders have now raised capital. Some of them are, one of them is an angel list. One of them is now living off the revenue of his app on the App Store. And that's the 2012 generation. So that's where we're at. Then the movie gets to where we are right now. Remember that I mentioned the Puerto Rico Science, Technology, and Research Trust. That is, from a government perspective, because in Puerto Rico, it's extremely hard to get anything done without government support because of the way that society works. There's no, the U.S. has 501c3s and the whole idea of voluntary associations, the Tocqueville, all that, very well established in the United States. It does not exist in Puerto Rico. So all the money and all the power and all the visibilities is in government. So we are kind of like targeting this organization and say, okay, that is the place where we have some leverage, where we can get some government support for some elements of the startup to build the startup ecosystem to the next level. That is to be determined. Omar, you had mentioned Kite Labs. Kite Labs is now hosted at the trust, and there's another company called Blimp that's also hosted at the trust. So we're doing our best to reprogram that little corner of the government to support that. The other thing that, from a government perspective, that is really worth pointing out is on June 6th, there was something called the Tech Summit. The Tech Summit, the CIO, the government of Puerto Rico has a CIO, and his name is Giancarlo Gonzalez. Giancarlo is an entrepreneur that sold part of his company. It was an asset sale. It wasn't like a full-blown exit, but he did the whole cycle. He started a company and sold assets and made money. And he's an investor. He's actually gone with, there's something called Geeks on a Plane, which is like Silicon Valley trip around the world. But he's actually been on those trips, et cetera. So he's like a real person, like a real startup guy. And he's now the CIO, and the first thing he does, he goes into, we're going to open up APIs. We're going to, instead of depending on Oracle and Microsoft to control all the IT infrastructure in the government, which they do, he started to say, hey, let's open up APIs, and once there's APIs, then us hackers can go in and hack the government. And so the Tech Summit occurred on June 6th, and that's precisely what happened. Renfis, by then, had already organized, I helped it, Renfis is really like the mastermind, organized 2 hackathons. Hackathons are events where, programmers spend all day long writing code for fun. And so we had been building up that community of hackers, and then when the government started opening up APIs, then we had basically a National Civic Day of Hacking, where people went in and wrote code against the government APIs. And that was like the big coming up party for the hacker community in Puerto Rico. And that just happened. That was June 6th. So, so there's that, force happening in terms of what the CIO is accomplishing with opening APIs. And then there's what's happening with the Science Technology Trust. And then from a community perspective, independent of what happens with those, then you see what these hackers are building, us as a community, the goal of creating 50 new companies and infrastructure that we're building, and you are part of it. I mean, this is part of the history of the development of Startups of Puerto Rico. My one quip is that it's called Fans and Friends, right, when it should just be Startups of Puerto Rico. I mean, the name implies that there's some separation, when in reality there's just one startup community, and that is located everywhere. And that's if you've perhaps heard about Parranda, which is how Christine and I met. Parranda is an outgrowth of TEDx, although there's other ways of thinking of what this is. Parranda is the realization that Puerto Rico is not 100 by 35 miles. It's the 8.5 million Puerto Ricans everywhere they live, in the Puerto Rico and the US and everywhere else in the world. And that we are a network, that Puerto Rico is the network, and that there's a tremendous opportunity to collaborate. So this is a manifestation of the concept of Parranda, and there is no blockage between us. So I would encourage you just to be Stars of Puerto Rico, the people in New York.
I agree.
So that is basically my version of the history. And Churchill said that history will treat me well because I will be writing the histories. So it's a great opportunity to be able to tell, the history, and that's where we're at. We are the community is at a place where it has an identity. It definitely exists. It doesn't depend on us, like Ramphis and I. Oh, actually, there's a piece of the whole strand that I failed to mention, and those are the bar camps. So while Ramphis and I were doing the event with Jason Calacanis and Jason Cohen and using Skype and video to start, the Blimp guys started as well. In 2010, Giovanni Collazo and Jose Padilla, Jose Padilla was still in school, started organizing bar camps. Bar camps are what are called unconferences. Unconferences are events where people go and they say, yeah, I'm going to speak, and then everybody gets a 5-minute speaking slot, and then people speak. So there's no agenda preset. It's just the seeing people that in the community build the event in real time. So they started building those events in November 2010. That was the first bar camp, and then they did a second one in San Juan, and then a third one in Mayagüez. So that community element also got built. And then there's another person that is incredibly important to mention, who is Axel Rivera, who started something called Startup After Hours, which is our social time every month. That is about 14 months old, more or less. And basically, it's on Facebook. It happens every month, and we just get together to drink. We're good at it. And that's an essential element because that's how, there's it lends cohesiveness to the system. There's a person here, Yamila Susta, who's actually spending the summer here in Hack, New York, which is an NYU program. He was essential to the hackathons that I mentioned. John was in Puerto Rico for the Tech Summit for that hackathon, so he has his whole perspective. So basically, that's where the movie is right now. There is a community that exists. It exists in both Puerto Rico and New York. There's actually it doesn't call itself a community, but there's a number of Puerto Ricans also in the Valley. Aldo Adriano at GFT, Miguel Rios at Twitter, Hector Ramos at Facebook, etc., that are part of the community. I mean, they don't think that they're like, look, Miguel Rios at Twitter contributed code to the to the Tech Summit hackathon. So so he was coding away in the Valley while we were coding away in Puerto Rico because it's just one community. Nice. So that is where we're at now. In terms of how I see the next steps, the big next step is capital. Capital focuses the mind of entrepreneurs. It's almost not. It's almost not the. You don't really need capital to accomplish a lot, but the fact that you know that there is, it focuses the entrepreneur in how can I get that money. And so once you've got the entrepreneur's focus, then you have an opportunity to train them. That is why accelerators are powerful, because there's a gold at the end of the rainbow. So then people will ask the question, what do I need to do? And then you can instruct them. If there's no gold at the end of the rainbow, then the community will tend to not develop a lot of momentum, because there's nothing, there's no path that is very clear. I mean, if you happen to be Steve Jobs, then the path exists in your mind and you can create it. But most of us are not Steve Jobs, so the existence of capital will cause a linear progression for the companies. We actually have, and now that New York is, we have a New York element to our community. On October 15th, we're going to hold the Puerto Rico Startup Showcase. We're going to, Microsoft has offered to sponsor, so the space, and basically we're going to have an event where startups in Puerto Rico are going to come up, and then we'll be able to showcase and embed them within the New York community. So that's going to happen October 15th, and you've all been volunteered to be part of that event. So that is basically where we're at. That's how it happened. At least that's how I'm going to say it happened. And thank you very much.
Awesome. Thank you.